think oh, there we go. Okay. So when we talk about network science, some of you will be aware of this, some of you maybe not so much, but this is what we sort of look at. So those circles are individuals. In this case, they're people, but they could be, departments. And then the lines in between them are connections. And it can be anything. So it could be, who do you trust? Who do you hang out with? Who do you turn to for career advice, which is something I look at a lot. It also could be who do you build to the same project? Who do you work with on a team? It can be all kinds of different things. And these are the reasons why people might look at this purely from a business strategy viewpoint, because we can look at this and we can see silos, we can see influential people within this. But we're in here to look at what networks can tell us about diversity and inclusion. And at the organizational level, they can tell us, who turns to who for career advice. And that can be really useful. I'll talk about that in a second, some of my research. Understanding if our formal sponsorship programs are working. We can look to see if people have different outcomes. Are people who are in the center of exchange for instance, when men are in the center of exchange, is it beneficial to their career? When women are there, is there more indications of burnout? So we can take a look to see if those sort of things are happening. We can take a look to see who is connected to who. Do people have diverse networks? Are people able to connect to people who are more senior than them? I'll show you that data in a minute. And then we call them employee resource groups in the United States. You can see sometimes they create an integrative force. Sometimes they create a separating force, both of which can be very useful depending on where the organization is sort of in the life of that. At first, it's very helpful to have a home, and then the work of that employee resource group can be to integrate people more thoroughly, and that's a reaching out kind of thing. At the organizational level, when you're looking at a huge network of either a team, a department, or a whole organization, there's all kinds of things that you can find out. So for one thing, you can bring precision to your equity, diversity, and inclusion efforts. You can say, we're doing great here, challenges over here. And so you can make your investments more strategically in equity, diversity, and inclusion. You can take a look at, you can use it for accountability metrics. People say they're developing diverse talent. Are they? You can test that. You can identify high leverage people who are already doing integration, connection well, reward them for it, and leverage their insights. They can put those people on the committee for bringing in newcomers or distributing some idea that the organization wants people to know about. You can restructure work very thoughtfully. Where are we seeing silos? Where are we seeing disconnection? This is particularly relevant to issues around diversity. Are there areas that are very white, very male, very different, very affluent, if that's one of the things that you're looking at, what school you went to or something like that. You can restructure the work to create relationships around the work, because that's really the key, right? Forming relationships. You can take a look at top performers, codify what they're doing well. You can identify particular people who are in the middle or who are connecting, and look at some of the people who are on the edges, because we know from lots of research that they are most likely to be leaving the organization. They're the biggest flight risk you have. And then you can assess the effectiveness of diversity investments. If you're like people at most organizations, you've had some kind of unconscious bias training, for example. That's like kind of all the rage, right? Did it work? Did it have any effect? You can actually test that. And underlying those pictures is our matrices, and we perform matrix algebra on them. And that's how we can get statistical tests and tell you, yeah, the people who underwent this training demonstrate connection in a different way than the people who didn't go through that training. So that's like a huge, very quick overview of what you can see from taking an eagle's eye view of a network. And that's what we mean by taking a look at the network science. And these things here where I'm showing what you can use network patterns for. lots of research behind these, lots of things that we already know are likely to be differentiators. I want to show you one more thing, and then I want to take a pause so that we can get some conversation going. So all these things we know about, and I work particularly around women and gender inclusivity, but a lot of what I do applies to other historically underrepresented groups, and of course intersectionality. So, you know, women of color have usually increased challenges in a lot of these ways. But what we do know, and what you can look for when you're looking at networks, are the three challenges that many people from underrepresented groups face. Who's in their network, where they are in their network, and how their network is structured. I'm just going to go into those very quickly and then step back so we can talk a bit. So this is from some work that I did that was published in MIT Sloan Management Review. If you're already from a historically underrepresented group, if you drift, as we all do, to talking and feeling more comfortable around people who are like you, then you're going to be talking and drifting towards people who have less status and fewer resources, because that's what it means to be historically underrepresented. I'm seeing a pop-up of the slides. I think so. I don't see why not. So here is a study that I did and reported on in MIT, the Sloan. We took a look at the average number of connections comparing men and women at each level in the organization, junior, professional, and then senior. We broke it out by men and women, and we saw that at every level, men had more connection to senior people than women did. And this was quite a stunner for this organization because they had just had a formal sponsorship program. They thought they were doing really well. But if you put a bunch of people in a room or around a table and people start chatting and finding small talk and things in common, you're going to have more comfort and more ease with somebody who's a lot like you. And so we just keep replicating the relationships that are already providing differences between inclusion and exclusion. So without intentionality, this is what we'll drift into. So this is some numbers I found around who is in people's networks. When I looked at women, and this is related, where they are in the network. And this is very important because you can feel really connected to a bunch of people. You're embedded in your department or you're embedded in your team and not realize that you're really out of the flow of important information. So we took a look at where women were in their networks, and we found that they were very central, and we pulled the effective administrative role out of here, or role, and we found that they were very central in those networks when being asked, who do you turn to when making decisions that are non-critical that affect your day-to-day work? Great. But men were central in the critical decision-making network. They were central in the source of new ideas, and they were essential with providing important information. So you can feel very connected and actually have a high engagement score and not realize that just because you're busy doesn't mean that you're connected to real conversations that are actually changing the core of work. I'm going to present one more idea and then take the pause. So this idea of the structure. Network science has showed us a lot. I can tell you that this guy, Bill, there on the bottom left, who no one, by the arrows, you can tell who's turning to that person and who that person turns to. Bill is only turning to other people. Nobody's turning towards Bill. So that expertise is untapped. People are not understanding that expertise and not leveraging it to its fullest potential. Someone over there on the right, Pam, is in the center, and we know that being really central enables access to new information. Anything that's going on among any people in that team, Pam knows about. And Pam has an enhanced ability to coordinate and implement ideas. This is when on your teams, as a team leader, you want to see something like this for your internal team network. External, whole nother ballgame. And if you look at John, you can see John is what we call a boundary spanner. John is connecting sort of clusters in the network, and that's a really important position That enables knowledge transfer throughout the organization. This is how you learn about innovations in different parts of the organization. And we know that people like John get promoted faster, make more money, more likely to be tapped as top talent, more likely to be involved in innovation. This is a really powerful boundary spanning position. And in my research, what we found is holding role constant, pulling that out so it doesn't affect the nature of what you need to do. Women are far less likely to occupy that important boundary spanning role than are men. So now's when I want to take the pause. I threw out a lot. I have some ideas about what you can do as individuals for these things, but I want to see what interests you or what you'd like to know more about what I just talked about. I see a hand raised. You're going to just have to talk because I can't see everybody.
Hi, I'm Anjum. No, thank you for that. It's really interesting because my role is the BME engagement and research lead for staff support services. So we're looking at health and care staff accessing mental health and wellbeing support. And we had to take a step back and look at the barriers to people from ethnically diverse backgrounds coming forward and engaging, despite all the data that we had about disproportionate impact of COVID and issues with disciplinary actions and complaints of discrimination and racism. And it's really interesting when you were describing the who and where and how that it relates so well. I can clearly see how staff are disengaged and they're just one or two standout people who do put themselves forward and link in with different groups and people who can make where, as you said, where the decisions are being made or where the strategy is being discussed. But my question to you was, and what personally in my role I've found frustrating is embedding how to make use of these nets. So the networks exist, and in all NHS organizations, we have networks for different groups of people, but how to influence the decision makers to have some sort of structure around the network so that the learning or there's some accountability, there's an impact of the value that group it brings to the organization. Because at the moment, I think across the geographical area that I work in, different network groups are at different stages of maturity. They're structured differently. Some are closed groups, some are open groups. But my question to you is if you had any suggestions about how to influence the powers above to actually make use of and, let's say, perhaps document or use those networks, because we know they bring value, but we need people to listen and to implement and take action rather than just ticking a box and saying, oh yeah, great, we've all protected characteristics have a network group and they can put that in their external reporting, but to actually make a difference and hold people accountable for listening and implementing what comes out of these groups?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one I hear a lot. I talk sometimes on a podcast that talks just to chief diversity officers, and that's one of their big issues is how do I make these groups, these employee resource groups, as effective as possible in terms of really deeply including and integrating the people in their network, in the larger network. So that's a great question. A lot of people ask it. So there's a couple of things you can do and things that I've seen at different organizations. So I do think that when these networks are first formed, they provide a home for people who might not see other people like them walking around the halls. They provide a great place to people have shared experiences, can start talking about those experiences and realizing, oh, wait, you had that happen too, or this has been your experience as well. I think that's a really important function. And I think that deeply, it helps people who may be at risk of disengaging from engaging in the organization. I think one first thing that happens is you start to realize you have some common concerns or some common issues or some common challenges, and those can be brought by your network leadership up to more senior leadership. As it matures, as that group matures, it's no longer doing its population a great service to keep it isolated, relatively isolated. We're just, here's a home for us here. What we really need to do is make yourself not necessary, right? What you really want to do is not need to have those kinds of employee resource groups anymore, because people are just highly identified with the whole organization, right? So how do you bring your experience to the larger organization? So one organization that I've worked with has had parts on their performance evaluation where you're asked to become an ally for different groups. So you are maybe asked to do it for 2 groups or something like that, and your role is just to go and listen. And you just go and you're hearing and you're learning about some people's experience, whether for whatever background, but it's some group that you don't personally identify with. Then the other thing that I think is really important is to start building those relationships with senior leadership. And a great way to do that is to form a committee on how better to integrate and serve this subpopulation into our larger population, and working with senior leaders on that committee, so that you have a lot of things. So one thing you have is the committee is doing the work that you want to do, sort of identifying challenges, barriers, and ways to address them. But more importantly, you're working with senior leadership, and they're starting to form relationships with the people that they're working with over the work, right? So that you're starting to see the capabilities and the potential. And I've been with organizations that have their sort of senior leadership team. Each team is working with a different set of a different task force. And so you're putting people in touch with senior leadership, you're forming those relationships, and you're doing the work that the organization wants to do. So those are at least a couple of different ways that I've seen organizations do things. I think one other one that you're probably already doing is just sort of really highlighting areas of success and making sure that you're doing communication about them in a way that's easily digestible, whether that's an ebook or a senior leadership shout out or a brief story told in a particular context. Those have impact when people, not just one time, but when people are consistently hearing and celebrating that story, that can have a lasting impact. I see other hands up, so go ahead and yell out.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what was just said. I mean, there are things like reverse mentoring, reciprocal mentoring with senior leaders and your chairs of networks or members of the network as well, to help that foster those great relationships and understanding. And also then coming down the line into directors and further down as well, as a culture shift. And one of the biggest things is, let's mandate it under policy, because then we'll see the quickest change. So really, CQC should be mandating meeting with their networks as part of their well-led inspection, because I think that would raise the platform for networks to be invested in. And remember, network chairs usually I say, don't have access to training. They're people who are really passionate and want to make a difference, or want to create those safe spaces, at least for people to talk and then start building in order to change culture. But it is about, if we're really serious, influence CQC to say, let those voices be part of your inspection, because I think that's where we will see the biggest and fastest change, investment and collaboration and networking from senior leaders, instead of moving from the tick box in some organization to a more kind of embedding strategically.
Absolutely. That's a great idea. I'll throw out a few things and then we can go back to conversation as we have time. Oopsie daisy. So if you're from a historically underrepresented group, and I'm not surprised, I was seeing in the chat earlier that that people were holding back when they're from a historically underrepresented group. There's a lot of good reason for that, for trust broken with systemic racism, for example, with dealing with unconscious bias in every hour of their lives. That's a pretty natural reaction, to be protective and to hang back until you understand if a space is safe. But I will tell people who are from historically underrepresented groups, they might not realize, and I talk to a lot of women, that there is this important network, that social capital is super important, that it's not just your credentials and what you can do. It's who you know and how they know you and how they want to work with you. And people who have been moving themselves from one place to another based on their technical skills, you can only do that for 5-10 years into your career. And then you really have to understand the impact of social capital, which is why a lot of people see a big drop off around 5 to 7 years, especially on your organizations be more on the administrative side. So understanding that they exist and that they're important, reframe how you view networking, that it's about relationship building. Think about, creating one of those images in your mind of the network and then reaching out very strategically to different people. Leverage the fact that you have this experience with diverse voices. There's a lot of people in your organization who are making important decisions who don't have that experience. They need to know. One thing in particular women are very good at is building a strong external network. Maintain that. Keep up those relationships from previous jobs. That brings in all kinds of new ideas and creativity into how you do your work. And then seek out opportunities to work with people who are different. If you are from a historically overrepresented group, sort of accept that you're going to drift into relationships with people who look a lot like you. I'm in a hiring committee right now for a new faculty member, and I have to constantly remind myself, well, maybe the reason I'm thinking positively about this person is because they're white like I am, or a woman like I am, and think to myself, I have to fight against that. I got to look at other aspects of the person that I'm connecting with. It might be taking you a little out of your comfort zone to interact with people who are different from you. Think about who you're helping and who you're not helping. Who do you cut slack to and who do you not cut slack to? And try to make sure that that's a little more equalized. Make sure you're reaching out to everyone on a regular basis. You can use some nudge technology for that. One really neat thing that I've seen organizational leaders do is put in place gig rotations where people can apply for short part-time work in other parts of the organization. And that's been really successful because it allows you to build relationships so that you don't get effectively ghettoized in one part of the organization. So I am sorry that I've thrown so much at you in a very short amount of time, but I hopefully whetted your appetite to learn a little bit more and to think about how network science might support your equity, diversity, and inclusion efforts. I think we have to back now.